the kind of things that Dr. Prescott Weinstein is teaching her students about in college are the same kind of things that Naftuli Moster is hoping students will learn about in high school and elementary school, and that is the realities of the world out there, science, and what people have discovered. Our next guest joins us from New York. Naftuli is a founder and executive director of Yaffed, which stands for Young Advocates for Fair Education. Yaffed is at the forefront of pushing for improved general studies like math, science, and history in ultra-Orthodox schools. And its supporters include both people who have chosen to leave those communities in part because of this issue, but also many people who are still ultra-Orthodox and still want to fix this problem, which is an ongoing issue. And so Naftuli, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today on Erev Shavuot. And I wanted to start just by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you got started on this important work.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi, for having me here. And I was listening a little bit into the previous session from Dr. Prescott Weinstein, and I was thinking to myself, she said that, you know, we're a religion that encourages asking questions. I come from a very different background where that's not exactly encouraged. So so as I'll probably tell you more a little bit as we go along. But yeah, so sorry, what was your question? You asked me to introduce myself?
Yeah, just to tell us a little bit about your story and how you got involved in this work.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up ultra-Orthodox. I grew up in the Hasidic community. I belong to the Belz Hasidic sect. I don't know how much your viewers know the kind of breakdown of the ultra-Orthodox community, but so the ultra-Orthodox community consists of two main groups. One is called the Litvish, also often called Black Hat, also often referred to as Yeshivish. The other side is called Hasidic, but it's confusing because the Hasidic ones also wear black hats and also go to yeshiva. So just want to put that out there. And then the Hasidic community, of course, is then broken down into subgroups, often referred to as Hasidic sects. So there are approximately about a dozen very large sects with thousands or tens of thousands of families. And then you have many smaller ones, you know, consisting either of a few hundred families or frankly, just a few dozen. So I grew up in Belz. Belz is one of the larger ones. It's actually headquartered in Jerusalem. There's a big synagogue. A lot of people refer to as the kind of the Beis HaMikdash. But they have a big presence in all over the world. Well, not all over the world, but in a few main countries like, you know, the UK and London and Belgium, Montreal, and the US. So yeah, I grew up in that community in Borough Park. I am the middle child of 17 kids from one father and one mother. And I went to the Belz Yeshiva my entire life. And this is another important part of this, that this is common. In other words, in the Hasidic world, you tend to go to the yeshiva of your sect. The boys go to the yeshiva, the girls go to the girls' yeshiva. And we actually call it school, girls' school. And so, yeah, so I went there my entire life from when I was like 2.5 till I was 19 years old. And then when I left yeshiva, I kind of had this idea of becoming a psychologist. And it was unique or bizarre because in my community, there weren't any psychologists, maybe one real psychologist. But I did see a lot of mental illness in my community and even in my own family that clearly went undiagnosed and untreated, and I really felt I'd be good at it, so I wanted to pursue it. The problem was that I knew nothing else. I didn't know what college is, what I would need to get in there, and so forth. But I had heard of this Orthodox college. It's a branch of Touro College located in Borough Park. So I went in there, and I proclaimed that I want to become a psychologist, and they me if I had a high school diploma, and I was like, what is that? I didn't know that I even attended high school or any equivalent. I figured I attended yeshiva. High schools are like for goyim, you know. So they said, no, don't worry, go to your yeshiva if you have a high school diploma, and maybe you can get in. I went ahead and I did that. They gave me a letter that I completed high school. Problem is, it was nothing. It was just a piece of paper. It wasn't backed up by a transcript or anything. So They tried to give me an entrance exam, which consisted of writing a basic essay and doing an easy math quiz, and I couldn't do either. I didn't know how to write an essay, or even what the word essay meant. I hadn't heard it before. I couldn't do basic math, basic arithmetic even. So it was a tremendous struggle. But beyond that, I also didn't know anything about college, like, what a semester is, what a major, minor. People don't understand. They often think like, oh, we don't learn English. So like we come out with a broken English. We don't learn anything, right? So anyway, so in the end, I managed to get in because they really wanted my tuition. So they got me into the school, and I was struggling immensely. And at some point, I began doing some research in terms of what do non-public schools in New York have to provide compared to, let's say, public schools. And I was just shocked to learn that the laws are so clear that they must provide an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to public schools. In other words, they can provide a better education or the same education as public schools, but they can't be worse. And it's also common sense, right? What private school where parents pay thousands of dollars would be worse than the public schools, right? But I guess they didn't account for Hasidic yeshivas. So that's kind of like how it all started. I began meeting with education officials, elected officials, and so on and so forth. I don't want to pack it all into the intro, so I'll let you ask some more questions.
Sure. Well, I was going to ask you, what have been some of the biggest challenges in the work that you've been doing? I imagine some of them come from within the ultra-Orthodox community and their response, and some are from the outside world as well, because I know there are a lot of vested interests at play that have made it really challenging for you.
Yeah, and that's a great question. The challenges from within are given. It's a very insular community, very controlling leaders. Anyone who kind of steps out a little bit, suffers immediate consequences. So we get why, getting people from within the community to speak out would be a challenge. The more frustrating thing, the challenges that come from the outside, the fact that the ultra-Orthodox community or Haredi community wields such a powerful voting bloc and is very sophisticated politically, and either whether it's because of strong relationships or because certain officials, elected officials or future, candidates for office really want to tap into that bloc vote, it's very hard to make progress. And this happens on a city level, on a state level, and to some degree, even on a federal level. So that's been one big challenge. The other one, I have to say, has more to do with the attitude of the broader Jewish community, where we kind of encounter two opposite extremes. One is, I want nothing to do with those freaks, let them implode and whatever, they're not the same religion. I don't consider them the same religion as us. I want nothing to do with them. The other side is like, oh, that's the future of the Jewish people, and they romanticize it. It's the sense of like, they are able to practice religion authentically. So let's, kind of give them deference and prop them up and give them money and support and cover. So that just means that for us, it means that you don't have enough of a voice in the broader Jewish community telling the education department, telling elected officials and candidates that this is important. In some way, because it is the future face of the Jewish people, we need to make sure that they are educated and not dependent on government assistance and destitute and disengaged from the broader world. Because, think about the contrast between what we think of now when we think about the Jewish community and its place in society versus the Hasidic community, which again, in a few decades, especially in New York and of course in Israel, is going to be the face of the Jewish people. So that just—
Well, I'll say it'll be a face of the Jewish people, because there'll be plenty of faces like yours and mine who have made different choices with their life.
Well, of course, but there, I guess, in the sense of like when elected officials or the public thinks about like Jewish people, that's going to be the image that is conjured up,
Absolutely.
and rightfully so. We've done a study in 2017 that by 2030, 30% of Brooklyn's youth will be Hasidic. 30% of all of Brooklyn's youth, not Jewish youth, not public school youth, 30% of all of Brooklyn's youth. Now, obviously, that's because the Hasidic community is mostly concentrated in Brooklyn, but obviously they're also in Rockland County, Orange County, and other parts of the state, and it's growing. It's the fastest growing population. So it is foolish to look the other way and think, we just don't want to deal with it because the problem isn't going away.
It also reminds me of the fact that historically, this is not a new Jewish kvetch. There have been maskilim enlighteners going back 150 years or more who have been talking about the limitations in the traditional yeshiva cheder style education system and their desire to learn other languages and to be part of the modern world and to have doors open to them for more opportunities. And so for the more liberal Jewish community to sort of stick their head in the sand and say, this isn't our Jewish mission, ironically, you're talking about letting Jewish kids learn the kind of things that you take for granted and value. And it's unfortunately allowing these communities and sometimes their leadership to slam the doors on them to limit their possibilities of, as you said at the beginning, asking questions and having the right to be in charge of their own life.
Yeah, but I do want to clarify one thing. I don't consider our movement in any way similar to the Maskilim. I think the truth is, I have to say, Adam, we didn't learn history, so I don't know anything about the Maskilim, to be honest. This is the point that I try to tell people. Our education was so limited. We also didn't learn about the Holocaust. I mean it. Yes, we heard that 6 million Jews were murdered. Yes, we heard that our grand rabbi was somehow rescued, but we didn't learn about the Holocaust, the history, post-Holocaust. We didn't learn any of that. So we also didn't really learn about the Maskilim. But from my understanding, this is the Maskilim, wanted to really change the nature of the Jewish people, the Orthodox people. This is not what this is about. This is about, first of all, we have a law in New York State, and the Talmud says that, you have to follow the law of the land. The Talmud says, you got to teach your son a trade, otherwise they turn to theft. That's really, we're talking more about the technical stuff. Now, there are plenty of people out there who want more, who want the ultra-Orthodox to be even more, maskilim, enlightened. That's not us. We focus, put it this way. If Hasidic yeshivas tomorrow began teaching English, math, science, and social studies for a proper amount of time, taking it rigorously, we would shut our doors. We wouldn't exist. So our existence is really more for the technical stuff, to allow Hasidic families to be self-sufficient, to support themselves. And yes, for those who choose to leave the community, it shouldn't be something that leads them to want to, commit suicide. It shouldn't be such a difficult thing to do. They should have the basic tools that they are afforded by New York State law.
So what keeps you going through this frustration? Our first speaker is someone who works on Jewish-Arab coexistence in Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, this week has been such a challenging week for his work. And you've had these challenges over the years. What keeps you going through the frustrations and sort of gives you, if not hope, at least motivation to have another protest and write another op-ed and do one more thing?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mention it, because I actually posted about this during the week, about the kind of comparison or the similarity in this type of challenge, and it's a challenge. Sometimes I do kind of feel hopeless in some sense, right? But oftentimes I look at other movements, and oftentimes it's just this combination of things that happened that lead the public to have a new realization about an issue, and then you're right there positioned to help move the process along. And I'll give you an example. Regardless of where your audience stands on this issue of, let's say, defunding the police, it's not a new movement. It has existed for decades. But when you have an officer murdering a person, George Floyd, and then the whole world gets to see it, and then suddenly it was just the situation was ripe. So similarly, I'll give you an example. I mean, just as we go into the holiday tonight, we're learning about another tragedy in Israel where bleachers at a Hasidic synagogue fell apart. And to me, this just shows that allowing the Haredi leaders to self-govern, right? Or as many Israeli papers call it, give them autonomy is a big mistake. Rabbis, and especially in the Hasidic sense, they're good for spirituality. They can advise on issues around the Torah. But when it comes to what kind of secular education their kids should get, or what kind of safety mechanisms, whether it is, like we saw in Meron, or COVID related, they are just not the right people for it. That's where we have health officials, safety officials, education officials, and that's what the public needs to know. And frankly, the New York State government needs to understand that as well.
So let me ask you about a different layer of government, and that has to do with the mayor of New York City. We are in the midst of a mayoral campaign, as I understand it. They had their first public debate online. And following your work, I know that Mayor Bill de Blasio has been the opposite of helpful in the work that you're trying to do. So what are your hopes and fears from a new Mr. or Ms. Mayor for New York City?
Yes. So unfortunately, the situation there is not very hopeful either. So the front runners, two front runners, have both already kind of pandered to the ultra-Orthodox and the Hasidic community and leaders by saying they're not going to enforce the law. They're not going to push for substantial equivalency. That's the name of the law to be followed. So that's pretty worrisome, because yes, you're right. We thought Mayor de Blasio was a big, coward, for the lack of a better term, and has really caused a lot of harm to this by delaying and delaying and delaying. And we were hoping a new mayor would be different. So, I mean, there's still hope. There's hope to, first of all, that another candidate could win. There's hope that these candidates would come around and realize the importance of it. And if not, there's always the so-called, resistance. They get elected, and we fight hard in multiple fronts, in terms of awareness, legal efforts, as well as legislation, and to bring about the proper enforcement. But keep in mind, this issue is not only limited to New York City. Right. But you're right that the mayor within New York City, the mayor is the one who would determine whether or not to enforce it. So if there's any call to action for the audience, it is, to make that an issue, to think about how massive this issue is. We discussed, whether you like it or not, the future face of the Jewish people at this moment, at this rate, is going to be illiterate, poor, dependent on government assistance, disengaged from the world and from other important issues. And we have an opportunity to change that now by insisting on enforcing this education standard. So make this your single issue vote. There are a lot of people who are concerned about all kinds of progressive causes. There aren't enough people who are going to say, this is my most important thing. Anytime you run into a candidate, you run into an elected official, just unprompted, go ahead, ask, what's your position on this? I want to make sure that you will enforce it.
And as a testament to the work that Naftuli has been doing, when our own movement started an initiative called Jews for a Secular Democracy, which is focused on advocating for the separation of church and state, we included in one of our core issues the issue of providing equal educational opportunities and content for people even in religious schools, in testimony to the work that Naftuli has done in awareness raising about this issue. I
just want to say, I can't thank you enough for that. And Paul, and I want to say, if only the UJA would put it into their platform, and other Jewish, the JCRC and the, New York Board of Rabbis. Yes, it's that important. So I really appreciate it.
And the last comment I was going to make, because we are standing on the edge of Shavuot, which is a holiday of learning, but of course, it depends on what you're learning. If you're reading the same thing, hafochba, turn it over again, and you're reading the same thing over and over again, then that's a different model than what we think of as learning. Even Jewish learning can have a much wider curriculum. I sometimes like to say, at least in our movement, our arc is wider. We can include science and math and knowledge and history as part of being a well-rounded person, as part of being a fully developed and fully educated person and citizen of your country and the world, in addition to having deep Jewish knowledge. So I applaud you for the work you've been doing in broadening that arc, even for the most Orthodox communities, for the benefit of their children. If nothing else, it's the kids who really suffer the most from this result, and then the families that they produce. It becomes, from generation to generation, an ongoing issue. So I applaud you for the work you've been doing, and ask you if you have any last thoughts before we wrap up.
No, I think what you just described is important because only in hindsight, when I was an adult and going to college and learning, pursuing that degree in psychology, did I realize that some of the Musar rabbis and Hasidic rabbis, the ancient ones, actually had a great education at the time. So, for instance, what was at the time known as, the matter that exists, like now we know there are like a bunch of different types of matter. Like, again, I didn't take science exactly, but the point is, but they talk about it in some of the Hasidic books, but, from what was known hundreds of years ago. And it just goes to show, I mean, forget, everyone always talks about Maimonides being so educated, but it is clear that other Hasidic rabbis were also educated in their time. And it's just astonishing that a lot of that for the Hasidic community now, it's like, yes, we're going to study that rabbi who was actually educated. We're going to study his books, and we're going to insist on not studying any more secular education that is more relevant to our time. I think that's very, short-sighted and misguided. And we're going to stay the course and fight for it. And we have a timeline. We're thinking that in about a year from now, the state will finally vote to adopt these proposed changes and begin enforcing. But we welcome everyone's involvement and support. And thank you so much again for this opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naftali, and thank you for being here. And Chag Sameach to you and yours.
Sameach.